Today's episode is sponsored by Republic Boot Company of Houston, Texas. Brad Boyer and his crew at Republic Boot Company are currently working on a pair of custom cowboy boots for me. The bottoms will be oil-tanned bison, and the tops will be baby blue with a vintage-inspired design. Keep an eye on my social media for pictures in progress, and I'll report back on Cowboy Crossroads once the boots are on my feet. You can find out more about Republic Boot Company at republicbootcompany.com. If you haven't heard yet, this week was the official release of my new album, Shadow of a Cowboy. It's available now on iTunes, Amazon, Apple Music, and Spotify. You can order physical CDs and other merch at my website, andyhedges.com. I'm really proud of this record, and I hope that you'll give it a listen. I'd like to start today's episode with a poem written by Arizona cowboy Gale I. Gardner. Gale Gardner wrote this piece in 1917. It's probably more often done as a song than a poem, and it's certainly become a classic amongst working cowboys. The title of this is The Sassy Peats, also known as Tying Knots in the Devil's Tail. Away up high in the Sassy Peats, where the yeller pines grow tall, old Sandy Bob and Buster Jig had a roe deer camp last fall. Oh, they taken their hosses and running irons and maybe a dog or two, and they 'lowed they'd brand all the long-eared calves that come within their view. And any old dogie that flapped long ears and didn't bush up by day got his long ears whittled and his old hide scorched in a most artistic way. Now one fine day, old Sandy Bob, he throwed his seago down, says, "I'm sick of the smell of burning hair, and I allows I'm going to town." So they saddles up and hits 'em a lope, for it weren't no side of a ride, and them was the days when a buckaroo could ile up his inside. Oh, they starts her in at the Kentucky bar at the head of Whiskey Row, and they winds up down by the depot house some 40 drinks below. Then they sets up, turns around, and goes her the other way, and to tell you the God-forsaken truth, them boys got stewed that day. As they was riding back to camp, a-packing a pretty good load, who should they meet but the devil himself, a-prancing down the road. Says he, "You ornery cowboy skunks, you'd better hunt your holes, for I've come up from hell's rimrock to gather in your souls." Says Sandy Bob, "Oh, devil be damned, we boys is kinda tight, but you ain't a-going to gather no cowboy souls without you has some kind of a fight." So Sandy Bob punched a hole in his rope, and he swang her straight and true, and he lapped it onto the devil's horns, and he taken his dallies too. Now Buster Jig was a riata man with his gut line coiled up neat, so he shaken her out and he built him a loop and he lashed the devil's hind feet. Oh, they stretched him out and they tailed him down while the irons was a-getting hot. They cropped and swaller forked his ears, then they branded him up a lot. They pruned him up with a dehorning saw and they knotted his tail for a joke. They then rid off and left him there, necked to a blackjack oak. If you're ever up high in the Sassy Peats and you hear one hail of a well, you'll know it's that devil a-bellerin' around about them knots in his tail. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Colter Wall. Colter Wall is a Canadian songwriter and folk singer. Rolling Stone magazine has said Wall's voice is the biggest attraction here, sounding less like the croon of a Canadian-born millennial and more like Roger Miller after a long night of drinking. I sat down with Colter in Elko, Nevada during the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering where we were both performing and recorded this interview. Here's Colter Wall.
Saskatchewan's a pretty big province, like most of our provinces up there in Canada are pretty big, right? And it's a little, I think it's a little smaller than Texas, but not by much. And we have under 1 million, or maybe just like a little over 1 million people that live there. So it's big empty space, you know. And where I'm from is sort of the southwestern corner of the province, I suppose, with Montana to the south, pretty much a town called Malta, Montana, directly south of where I grew up. And then into the west, you get closer to Medicine Hat, Alberta, which is closer to where Corb's kind of set up out there. I'm pretty sure he's up by Medicine Hat anyways, or somewhere out there. But anyhow, southwestern Saskatchewan, the province, the further west you go, the more it gets a little more hilled and less flat. It's still the prairie, you know, but it's kind of more like coulee country. It's really good cow country out there, sort of right before you hit Alberta. So naturally, you know, the town I grew up in was, I guess, technically big enough to be called a city, but with all the nuances of a small town, you know. But a ton of kids from my high school, they were all raising cows and stuff, and were if you weren't farming or ranching, then you were probably working somewhere locally in town or on the oil rigs. You know, that's the kind of place it was in Swift Current. And I grew up in town, so I was, you know, I wasn't raised on a ranch. We have some family that does it and a lot of friends that do it, but I grew up a city kid. I didn't really start getting into the whole cattle thing until after I dropped out I went to a place called the University of Saskatchewan for 2 years in Saskatoon, which is sort of our big city in Saskatchewan. It's the biggest city we got. And there's a university up there. I went there for 2 years, and it wasn't going over well. I think the second year I was up there, the only classes I went to were history of the Civil War and poetry class, you know, and everything else I just blew off. So I dropped out, and I needed to get a job. My cousin was working as a hand at this ranch by a place called Rush Lake, Saskatchewan, which is sort of just east of where I grew up in Swift Current. It was like 1,000 head operation, and I kind of got, you know, weaseled my way in there because I sort of developed a passion for it. I wanted to learn a little bit about what everybody was doing around where I grew up, you know, and I grew up in town, so I felt like I missed out on it, and I always sort of loved Cowboys, and at that point I started getting into Western music. So I did that for a while, and, you know, green as grass, and I still am for the most part, but it was definitely a learning experience out there. I'd sort of, you know, I'd do that, go drive out to the ranch and work weeks, and then try to play gigs on weekends, local gigs. And at that point, you know, I had just had the EP out, I guess. Just gotten the EP out, playing those songs and stuff. I was lucky enough that the music kind of just started to take over a little bit. So eventually I quit working at the ranch out there by Rush Lake and came down to the States to start, you know, trying to really tour, because I'd only ever toured Canada, and it's such a big country, and especially where I'm from, such an empty place, it's really hard to, you know, you can find an audience out there, especially playing country and Western music, but it's still going to be small, you know, because there's nobody out there. It's tough if you're a traveling musician, you just end up spending a lot of money on gas, you know. And I love it to death, but it was hard to play. That's why I needed the job, you know. But things took off, and I went down to the States and started doing that and got away from the whole ranching thing. And then this past spring, I'm proud to say that I kind of started back up with that again, which I can talk more about later. Northern Saskatchewan's pretty wooded, treed, but most of where people live is closer to the southern part of the province, and it's all prairie. And the eastern part of it is more farmland, kind of flat, more like Manitoba. But like I said, further west you go, it starts to look more like sort of the foothills of the Rockies in Alberta, and it's better cow country. But it's a strange place. It's just a big, empty, windy place, you know. Up there on top of the sort of, once you get over the plains coming up from Billings up to Malta, and, you know, it's all part of that same stretch of big sky country, I guess, that sort of just crosses the invisible line, you know. So if you've ever been out to that part of Montana, that's as close as I could, you know, try to explain it for anybody that hasn't been up there in Saskatchewan. It looks a lot like that sort of area for sure. But I love it. A lot of people, there's a lot of jokes that people make about Saskatchewan. We kind of get, especially Albertans, it's kind of like the Oklahoma, Texas thing. Mm-hmm. You know, I know you guys love shitting on Oklahoma, and Albertans love to shit on Saskatchewan, you know. But people say, you know, stuff like you can watch your dog run away all week. On a clear day, you can see the back of your own head. Or if you stand on your tractor seat, you can see the curvature of the earth, you know, jokes like that.
Sounds a lot like Lubbock.
Yeah, it's fun. Actually, you know what? I took a picture outside of a place called Stewart Valley, Saskatchewan, which is just barely north of the Swift Current. So home, you know. And I had, you know, Doug Moreland?
I do.
Doug reached out. I posted it, and he goes, "Are you in Lubbock?" I said, "No, I'm home, man." But it kind of, you know, looks similar for sure. Big empty spot. I used to take some horseback lessons when I was really young. We had some friends that have a really beautiful property outside of Swift. It's Kurt Chikoski's the name of the rancher, and it's a ranch that I kind of reference in one of my songs. Actually, they call it the Martin's Farm, or the Martin's Ranch rather. And when I was a kid, they had like a Bible camp out there in the summer for the kids in town. We go out, and one of the things you could do out there was horseback riding. And I really got into that at that age and kind of never really stopped being fascinated by horses. But never had any experience with cattle ever. But I did grow up on songs about cattle, you know, in country and western music, just because that's what my folks like to listen to. And that's what, you know, that's sort of what would get played on, well, certain radio stations back home. I used to work, one of my first jobs in high school was at the radio station, local radio station, and I'd work Sundays, 8-hour shift on Sundays. They had a program on the radio station that was just all, I forget what it was called, Spirit of the West. That would they play on Sundays, and I was the programmer, so I'd have to play it. I'd sit there and listen to, you know, those songs for a long time. But, you know, my folks listened to, I guess, more honky-tonk stuff, but also some cowboy stuff here and there. So it was sort of always around, whether or not I was into it or not, you know, it was always somewhere kind of lurking around, that kind of music and that culture, I guess. And of course, when you're a kid and you're sort of brought up in a culture, I think you're either going to naturally be drawn to it or want to get away from it. So when I first picked up a guitar, I was like, you know, I just want to learn AC/DC, Black Sabbath stuff because of the country western stuff. That's what my folks listen to and my grandfolks listen to. That's not cool, you know. I got into rock and roll. I probably picked up a guitar around 13, was into rock and roll. And then, you know, if you go down that rabbit hole, you're headed straight for the blues. So I got into blues stuff. From there, I kind of started listening to some more folky stuff as I was getting older. And sort of came right back around to the country and western stuff that I was hearing when I was a little kid eventually, you know, in a full circle sort of thing. So that was sort of the early foundation for that stuff. But I'm also kind of a history nerd in general. And I've always loved learning more about where I'm from and the early days. And of course, you know, if you're going to do that, you're going to learn about the old cowboys back in the day when they were just starting out there and it was all pretty open country still, you know. So I've just, you know, I've always had that fascination and always needed to know. So I'm that way about songs too, you know, I got to know where it comes from or where people think it's come from or where people think it comes from and why, you know, why is this verse the same verse I heard in this other folk song or, you know, the floating verses and stuff like that. That kind of stuff just, for whatever reason, I'm super into. So I've always been, tried to be a student of that sort of thing, you know, and learn as much as I can. Which is why I'm happy that I'm finally here in Elko because I feel like it's, you know, I've been walking around with my ears open as much as possible, just trying to learn as much as I can, man, because I don't know, it's a passion of mine.
Most all of us who play this kind of music have looked to Ramblin' Jack Elliott to show us the way. Here's how Peter Rowan put it. Back at the beginning of the big folk scare, about 1961, singing about the mule skinner's blues, pastures of plenty, and Tom Joad, like a character out of Kerouac's On the Road, picking guitar, telling jokes, telling lies, mad as a hatter. We were all wanting to know how it was and where it all came from. Ramblin' Jack handed it to us on a silver platter.
Before, like I said, when I was sort of going down all the rabbit holes in the history of music, before I really got into the more cowboy stuff, and a lot of this has to do with Jack, actually, because I was listening to sort of more hard-traveling folk songs, like Woody Guthrie kind of stuff, Lead Belly stuff, and that sort of subgenre of, you know, folk music and North American folk music. I was really into that, and I got into Jack. And then because he would do, the thing about Jack that blows my mind is he did all kinds of folk music, man. I think he's predominantly known as doing cowboy stuff nowadays, but man, he did blueses and, you know, coal mining stuff, the Appalachian stuff and bluegrass stuff, and then of course the Western and the cowboy stuff too. And I'd been listening to him and his records and him singing Jimmy Rogers and Woody Guthrie and those guys. And I started to really get into him, and some of the, you know, the first time I heard Cy Repeats or Tying Knots in the Devil's Tail was Jack doing it. And his version of Old Paint's probably my favorite too. So he had a big part in that. I guess I don't really think about that too often, but he really did. But I guess it was just sort of like a transition in, you know, really wanting to know all this about how this music is generational and how it gets passed down, and it's the same with the cowboy stuff, you know. And I picked that up. I still love all those other kinds of folk songs too, but it felt more like, okay, these are, you know, coming from Saskatchewan, it can be tough to be like, what, you know, what's the music of that area, you know, because it's just nobody knows about it. Most people don't even know how to pronounce it, you know, down here in the States. So it kind of felt like once I started learning about these cowboy songs and these Western songs, traditionals, it was like, okay, I felt like I was learning more about where it came from, you know. So that sort of was fuel for the fire, I guess. But yeah, Jack had a lot to do with it, and that sort of transition I went through, and I'm still going through.
In an essay on guitars in his book, Ceremonies of the Horseman, my friend Tom Russell wrote this. I believe a guitar absorbs the spirit of every room and circumstance it passes through. It inhales the silence, spit, and spilled whiskey in the sing-along world of campfires, parlors, back porches, honky-tonks, and dressing rooms. The situations are ingrained in the living wood as the guitar changes its voice for the better. The journey informs the sound.
You know, I do a lot of Travis picking stuff, and that's something that I've been working on for a long time, since I picked up a guitar, really, for the most part. And that's a lot of, you know, listening to Doc Watson or Mississippi John Hurt or, you know, Towns or certain people that were just sort of known as, you know, Elizabeth Cotten, stuff like that. And Jack, too. Jack does some great Travis picking. But I really, as of recently, I've been trying to I do this. I guess it's the closest thing I could equate it to is maybe sort of like a Mother Maybelle thing, only not nearly as good, you know, where I'm sort of mimicking a flat pick thing that I do with my right hand, but I can't play with a pick. They just frustrate the hell out of me. So I sort of use the calloused end of my thumb here and the tip of my index and the fingernail, just sort of, you know, to mimic like having a flat pick. And I wanted to start doing that because I remember there's a video of Jack way back in the day on Pete Seeger's show. Pete Seeger had that Rainbow Quest show where he'd have just people come on and do folk music and stuff, and they're doing Mule Skinner blues. And Jack started picking, and he had that sort of, it's a bouncy kind of, you know, like sort of style of flat picking that he would do. And I was just enamored with it. And I thought, well, how can I get away with doing that even though I don't play with a pick? So that's sort of what led to me trying to do that. And listening to other people too, flat pick. I always sort of, Jack was my favorite just because I felt like he sort of did it. I can't flat pick like Norman Blake. I'm never going to be able to do that. I can't even play with a pick. But the way that Jack flat picks is it's got a ton of character in it. But it's all, that's what it is. It's not a lot of technical stuff, He's not pulling off too many crazy technical licks or anything. It's just all character and the way that he's doing it and the way that it moves. So that's where, my weird little, I guess, Carter family fingernail frailing thing sort of comes from. And aside from that, when I'm not doing that, I'm just Travis picking, which is easy enough, kind of like riding a bike. It's one of those things where, like, I couldn't finger pick too many other ways now. I'm so set in it, and it's just like muscle memory, boom, 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 boom. But I don't know. I love it, man. I love being able to do both, and I try my hand at both of them. I'm not really much of a guitar player, but I love picking on this old Martin.
Well, I was going to ask you about that old Martins. I think that's another important part of your sound, and
sure,
I know what it is, but I'd like you to just talk about what model that is and how you've got it tuned differently. And
sure, it's a 0017 1937 Martin. It makes me sound like I know what I'm doing. It's all mahogany. I keep it tuned to full step down, so this E string here, if it's open, is actually D, and so on and so forth. Full step down. The reason I do that is because they didn't put any truss rods in the neck back in the day. The pre-war Martins, they did not use truss rods at all. So I've been told by people that know about guitars that it's a good idea to have it tuned down because you don't want too much tension on a neck that doesn't have a truss rod. There's no way to adjust it. You could really bow it really bad, So, and that works out for me because I sing in a pretty low register, and that way I can cheat and throw the capo on. And if I want to be in standard, it's just right there on the second fret, and if I want to, here's an F if I want to sort of get crazy. Yeah, it's a beautiful guitar, man. It's got a really great sort of throatiness to it that I was immediately drawn to when I started playing it. I got it in Chicago from a friend at the Chicago Music Exchange. It's sort of a long story, but he lent it to me for a gig. So I was playing a gig and I didn't have my guitar. He said, come on to the shop and pick out what you want. So I picked the 37 Martin because I fell in love with it. And I went to give it back to him after the gig. He goes, hang on to it for a while, kind of thing, So I did. Eventually, I called him and was like, man, you got to take this guitar back. I'm afraid I'm going to wreck it, It's such a beautiful old instrument. He goes, oh, just buy it, man. Been waiting on you to buy it. And I couldn't really afford it at the time, but he cut me a really sweet deal because he was sort of a fan, I guess, and a good friend, and he cut me a really great deal on this guitar. So I've been playing it around ever since, recorded 2 records on it, and I'm going to get to work on a third here when I get a minute. But yeah, it's kind of become sort of my I don't know, it's sort of made its way into what I, changed. It's sort of changed the way I play in a lot of ways, and just because of the tones I get with this thing. But yeah, I love it to death. It's a great guitar.
And the way you tune it, it's really cool because it...
A lot of string buzz. I hear people complain about that, like YouTube comments and stuff. It's not quite as loud.
Yeah.
I can do a little more with bending strings and stuff because there's not as much tension, so that's nice. And I don't know, it just, again, it's mostly because of the truss rod, but it's sort of warped, or not, warped isn't the right word, but it's definitely had an influence on the way that I pick and the way that these songs sort of turn out, because it just has this weird sort of quality, buzzy, ringy, low-end sound to it. And yeah, I just feel lucky every time I pick it up,
Suits you well.
Thanks, man.
Colter Wall's latest record, Songs of the Plains, is a Western concept album in the same tradition as Marty Robbins' Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs and Johnny Cash's Ballads of the True West. In talking about Songs of the Plains, Colter has said, I went into the studio and knew exactly the story I wanted to tell. It's like having a mission statement saying, all right, let's make a Western album.
Well, I did, I made an EP first, and it was, that was kind of a concept record in its own way. It was sort of my take on some of the Appalachian folk stuff, because I was really diving down that rabbit hole at the time, which was why I called it Imaginary Appalachia, So I did that record, and then the next album I put out was self-titled, and it was just kind of a collection of true story, well, some fictional, but mostly, autobiographical stuff about weird stuff that had happened to me on the road that year or whatever. And there's a few songs in there that are just story songs and are completely made up. But that was sort of the idea with that record. And after that, I knew that, the next record had to be about home, and it just felt right. Especially, the last track on my self-titled album is a song called Bald Butte that I wrote sort of about. There's a place that we'd always go, my family would go to, and my folks got a cabin there now, but it's called Cypress Hills, and it's an interprovincial park, so it's on either side of, there's, half of the park's on the Alberta side and half of it's on the Saskatchewan side, right? But it's just a big sort of part of the plains that the glaciers missed, I guess, or whatever. So it's all, you're in the bald prairie, and then all of a sudden there's this really beautiful hill country that just juts up out of the ground, and it's wooded and thick, and they got a ton of moose, and it's really beautiful. But back in the day, there was all kinds of crazy stuff that happened out there. There's, fights with fur traders and some of the natives of the area, and the RCMP had a fort there. The mounted police were there, and there was also a bunch of ex-Civil War guys that were hiding up there, after, like Confederate guys after the war that were hiding up there. So that was the influence for the song called Bald Butte that I wrote. That was sort of that. It was the last song on the self-titled record I put out. And that sort of felt like a natural lead into the next record, just being about home and being sort of Western themed naturally. It was a no-brainer. As soon as I figured out I was going to do a bunch of songs about home, I knew they had to have a sort of Western vibe about the whole thing, and very Cowboy influenced for sure. It was something for a while. I didn't know where I should record it, and I ended up doing it in RCA, again, same place I did the self-titled one with Dave Cobb, who's a wizard, as everybody knows, and he doesn't need his tires pumped any more than they already are, so I won't do that. But he's a great producer and a great guy. And I pitched him the idea for the record, like it's just about, the Canadian prairies and a bunch of little references to that, and then a couple traditionals that I feel like fall in line with that whole Western theme and the cowboy thing. And he said, yep, sure, sounds great. And Dave's really good about equipment, for recording stuff. And I'd made a few, sort of just sonically, for give him an idea references. I'd mentioned those Marty Robbins albums. And the first Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs, which is my favorite one. I like the second one is pretty good too, but I think the first one's probably the best, in my opinion. And he went over to RCAB, which is next door, and drug out this big box-looking thing, chrome box, and he goes, this is an old plate reverb unit that Marty used on that record, and it's in on RCAB. And we're going to use it on your album. That's going to be the reverb on your vocals. Jaw hit the floor, pretty much. I told that to Corb when he came in, when we did Tying Knots in the Devil's Tail. I took a picture of him with it, like it was a person, He was as blown away as I was. That's the great thing about Dave, is he's able to just find out that stuff, and then he has the thing, That certainly, using that plate reverb unit definitely sort of fell in line with that, what I was trying to do with that album. It definitely was, everything about the record is pretty deliberate, as opposed to record prior to that I made was sort of experimental, and me handing over the reins to Dave in production land a little bit. Whereas the Songs in the Plains was definitely sort of just me at the helm, and this is what we're doing, and this is what we're trying to do, and this is the kind of record we're going to make. And so it took us a week. It's not too much more to tell than that. It was 10 songs and 1 week in the studio. One of the songs, Night Herding song, actually, that I did that traditionally, we recorded in Dave's backyard because we wanted to get a fire around it. And also, it's hard to sing a cappella in a studio that has no natural reverb. I kept singing off key, so we decided to try it outside. And so Dave's got a studio in his basement. We just lined out a mic to the backyard and built a little fire, and that's where I sang that one. So that's what those sort of pops and crackles are on the record. It's an actual fire.
Did you pick that one up from Jack?
And I picked that one up from Young Brigham. It's the first time I heard him do it. And I know he also does a different version of it on, it's a Monitor Presents record. And it's just Jack doing all Cowboy songs. But it's the one where he's got his Amtrak like bags with him in his guitar case on the cover. And he does a really beautiful version, and I heard in the song. But yeah, the first time I heard it was on Young Brigham, which is one of my favorite albums of all time. And maybe my favorite record cover. It's up there, It's a good one.
Songs of the Plains includes 3 old-time cowboy songs. Calgary Roundup by Wilf Carter, Night Herding Song by Harry Stevens, and Tying Knots in the Devil's Tail by Gail Gardner. I asked Colter to talk about where he picked up each of these tunes.
I picked up the Wilf tune. I was going down an Ian rabbit hole. I'm a big Ian fan as well, and he references Wilf Carter in a few songs, and also it's just all over the internet and that kind of stuff. But I think it was Alberta's Child. First time I heard Wilf Carter's name. Who's Wilf Carter, and what's a 78? At that time, I went down that rabbit hole and started researching this guy, listening to Wilf Carter recordings or whatever, anywhere I could find them, on the internet or Salvation. You'll find them in like some Salvation Army or something back home, or MCC or something. But it turns out, I'm just learning about this guy. It turns out he's a Canadian legend. I felt kind of stupid for not knowing him already, but I found out about him through Ian. Bought a bunch of his recordings, whatever he had on iTunes. I bought it all and listened to all those songs, and picked up on some tunes where you can tell he's definitely drawing from some old traditional, because I at that point sort of getting into that stuff, and I heard him do that Calgary Roundup one, and I knew that I thought at the time this will either make a cool swing or like a cool halftime thing if I can do it up the way I have in my head when I heard it, and we ended up swinging it. And when we play it live with the band, sometimes we might swing it sometimes, and other times it'll be halftime, just to sort of mess around with it, with the tempo, and then it sort of becomes like a Bob Wills is still the king feel, with the halftime beat. But other times, on the record, it's a swing. And I knew I wanted to swing on the record, and I knew I wanted something about the Stampede, because that's such a big part of Canadian cowboys in Western Canada. That's our Frontier Days, that's our big one, the Stampede, and it's been going on for so long. So it just seemed to make sense to pick that song, and I cut a few Wilf's verses out of it, which might piss some people off, I guess, but it just, we wanted to have it be a certain time. I was going to record it with the purpose of it being a single as well as have it on the record. So we were sort of wanted it to be whatever it is, close to 3 minutes, I guess. But yeah, that's how I heard that one and, fell in love with it. And that listening to Wilf resulted in me getting a little better at yodeling, because I've been trying my hand at yodeling here for just about the past year. And I don't have a lot of range in my vocals, but I've been trying to get better. I always try to get better singing, if I can. Wilf he almost had his own style of yodeling, so it's like nobody would do it. He did this weird like triplet thing. Trying to do that, I feel like it's sort of helped my range and improve me with that whole thing, which is why I had to put the yodel at the very end of the song when the bass starts walking and everything. It's also the only track on the record where he had Lloyd Green play pedal steel and Mickey on harp, Mickey Raphael, which was an honor to have both those guys. But that's the only track on the record where they both play, and they're kind of playing off each other, and I just love it, man. It's one of my favorites to listen to for sure. Yeah, like I said, Night Herding Song I'd heard from Jack's record, and I heard a few different versions of Tie Knots in the Devil's Tail, or Sire Repeats, or whatever you want to call it. I'd heard Michael Martin Murphey do it, and I heard Jack do it, of course, which was one of my favorites. Jack was the one I heard him do. That's why I sang Rusty Jiggs and Sandy Sam as opposed to Buster Jiggs and Sandy Bob, well, I think that Buster Jiggs is actually the way Gail wrote it, probably. I'm sure you probably know that better than I would, but that's probably the original. But I always loved the way Jack would go, Sandy Sam was a Riata man. That sounded great. So that's why I sang it that way, and why I chose to do those lyrics. Corb's verse that he takes on the recording is he was very adamant about having it the way that Gail wrote it, and the proper, I suppose, proper lyrics. But that's the great thing about folk music is you can sing it however you want, I suppose. So many different versions and iterations of it. But yeah, I wanted a good, lighthearted, bouncing song to throw on the end of the record, and that just seemed like a no-brainer. Such a good song, such a funny tune. What I usually like to say, and it doesn't really work because, again, like you say, everyone has a different definition. Some people, I think, just have an idea that folk music is just a guy with an acoustic guitar. It doesn't matter what he's playing. They just see that and they go, oh, some kind of folky. I usually I call myself a folk singer because I play a lot of folk songs. And to me, a folk song is a song that it's either debated who wrote it or, because it's the songs that have been passed down over time and changed and edited, and sort of everyone has their different versions, and it's hard to really figure out who is the original author. That's folk song to me. That's why I call myself a folk singer, because most of my favorite songs are those either traditionals, and you can get in trouble with that too, because what's a traditional and how do you know it's a traditional and how can you prove it? But to me, that's what folk music is music that's generational and passed down and not learned any other way, just passed down and complete word of mouth sort of style. I love that, and I'm of course fascinated with that and all the weird things that go with that. How back in the day, that's why before copyright and all that, it was expected of you to rip stuff from folk songs. It's all Woody Guthrie's entire catalog is other songs, other melodies and other progressions and stuff. But that was what you were supposed to do if you're a folk singer. And nowadays you get in trouble for it. So it's sort of quite the shift in our culture, I guess. But I kind of love that notion of it doesn't belong to anybody and therefore it belongs to everybody. I kind of love that. And to me, that's what a folk singer is someone that's playing songs that have been around forever and aren't going away anytime soon. Yeah, so like I said, I played this earlier on stage. To my knowledge, this is called Found in $1 a Day. And Bo and I, my buddy Bo Smith, who's here, Texan guy, we have been trying to track down where that song comes from for as long as I've known about the song, And, but to no avail, which is frustrating and also awesome, It's kind of like, it's cool that can happen in 2019. Like, there's a song out there that just nobody knows where it came from, even what region it's from, There's a few theories. Bo's got a theory that it's just an old cowboy song that maybe Waylon heard around West Texas growing up, around Littlefield or wherever he's from. He's from Littlefield, right?
Yeah.
But anyways, Found in $1 a Day, I think. Somebody tell me if it's worth going on. Stuck in the saddle from the first light of dawn, worrying if dying from one of them horns stuck in my belly is worth being born. Stuck in the saddle for found in $1 a day. I'll never get rich, I found out too soon. Never can seem to get past the saloon. Cowboy and money don't mix, don't you see? They meet only briefly, then part company. Stuck in the saddle for found in $1 a day. $1 a day, 30 and found, days in the saddle and nights on the ground. Somebody tell me if I should stay, hey, hey. Stuck in the saddle for found in $1 a day.
$1 a day, 30 and found, days in the saddle, nights on the ground. Somebody tell me if I should stay, stuck in the saddle for found and $1 a day.
That's wonderful. I
Thanks.
love that, man.
I love it too. Thanks for having me here and for listening, man. I appreciate it.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Colter Wall for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Colter at colterwall.com. I'd like to thank Republic Boot Company for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about Republic Boots at republicbootcompany.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help me keep it going, you can go order my new album, Shadow of a Cowboy, available on the website and also on iTunes, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Or you could make a donation to my podcast. You could also write a review and leave me a 5-star rating on the iTunes store. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.